Hello and welcome to everybody who's joined the call today. For the Environment Act is here. Are you prepared? I'm delighted to welcome you to our winter learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions and topics you have told us that is of great interest to yourselves. So today's event is the Environmental Act is here. Are you prepared? So the winter learning programme is brought to you by Homes England Local Government Centre. This slide summarises who the Local Government Capacity Centre are and what the mission is. We established the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be best delivered. The next slide should be showing the learning programme. The learning programme is just one of the tools offered by the Local Government Capacity Centre. Our offers also include the Housing Information Hub, an index of professional housing resources accessible via gov.uk, fact sheets to support local authorities with the case for housing development and regeneration, and a capacity analyst tool, which you can use to assess capacity. We look forward to hearing how we did in the survey poll at the end of the session. Next slide, please. So on this slide here, you will see the agenda for today. So this is myself, Tom Maloney at Homes England, just introduced, and a few welcomes. Like I see, the number is still it's going up and up. So thank you for that. So the first speaker today will be Claire Warburton, Principal Advisor, Green Infrastructure, Natural England, and she will be discussing why is nature recovery important, what are the policy and legislative drivers. Claire will then pass on to Krista Patrick, Principal Consultant, Nature Recovery Network, Planning Advisory Service, PAS. Krista will be discussing what does this mean for local authorities and what are the issues local authorities are facing. Krista then will pass on to Duncan McCordial, Planning Strategy Manager from Manchester City Council, which Duncan will be discussing Manchester City Council policies and projects, Mayfield and West Gorton case studies. At the end of this, approximately around 3:05, we'll do a Q&A, question and answer session for about 20 minutes, and we'll highlight the questions most liked and most directed to the individual presenters. That will then lead on to 3:25, where we'll have a final thoughts and close and wrap up with some more polls at the end. We'll be finishing the Q&A session, and I will then be drawing the session to a close with some further polls to get some immediate feedback on the session and your ideas for future sessions, of course. So now I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, Claire Warburton, Principal Advisor, Green Infrastructure at Natural England.
Thanks very much, Tom, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about why is nature recovery important, and what are some of the policy and legislative drivers. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, Tom. Thank you. So the Dasgupta review in 2021 set out that our economies, livelihoods, well-being all depend on our most precious asset, which is nature. And we know that a healthy nature recovery network can support biodiversity, it can connect people with nature. And that can help to create climate resilient places, so trees that store carbon, that help to mitigate climate change and deliver net zero. Green travel routes can encourage low carbon active travel. Green infrastructure can reduce the risk to flooding and help to allowing water to permeate into our drains, into our sort of surface, into our groundwater, so that it prevents overwhelming of our drains. And there is also the way that green infrastructure can help to reduce heat in urban areas, bringing down temperatures by several degrees. So that's all really helpful for health of communities, and that can help to lead to economic benefit, where greening of our towns and cities can help to regenerate places, making them more investable and attractive to skilled workers and visitors as well. So there's a logic chain here around healthier, more resilient nature, close to where people live, meaning healthier, more resilient places, helping us to adapt to and reduce climate change and leading to healthier, more resilient people and a healthier, more resilient economy. So next slide, please. Nature and its component parts like soil, water, air are sometimes referred to as natural capital, and that can provide us with services, and these can be valued. So, for example, we know that the UK natural capital stock is estimated to have a value of £1.2 trillion. And a few examples of these individual services. So, for example, restoring half of our peatlands to near natural condition would bring a return of between 45 and 51 billion. We know that 82% of people agree that being in nature makes them happy. That's from Natural England's People and Nature Survey. But the health benefits of outdoor recreation in the UK are estimated to be around 6.2 to 8.4 billion. And there are also big land use changes going on. So between 1990 and 2019, we saw urban areas in the UK increase by 30% and enclosed farmland fell by 5%. So I'll pick up some of that, the implications of that in my next slide, but these are big figures, and what we really need now is a consistent way to gather this information for individual projects so we can scale that up and start to see markets developing for these services. Next slide, please. So just focusing in a little bit on those benefits from nature in urban areas, which is of growing importance. We know around 80% of people live in urban areas. So a few examples here. So from the right of the slide, the Wildlife Trust report recently found that for every £1 invested in health or social need projects that connect people with nature, there's a £7 social return. Urban nature provides around £15 billion worth of benefits to the economy every year. And as part of that, the value of air pollution removal services is around 800 million of avoided negative health impacts. And 2.1 million active visitors in urban blue and green spaces help to provide 74,000 quality adjusted life years to society. So some really significant benefits in urban areas from nature. If you move on to the next slide, please. So what really is the scale of the problem? And we know that the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. It's in the bottom 10% globally and the worst G7 nation for biodiversity loss. And the State of Nature report showed that species across the UK are continuing to decline in numbers. So in 2023, they found the numbers had fallen 19% since 1970. And climate change will only amplify these kind of pressures, and nature will be less able to provide those kind of benefits and services that we've just been talking about. Next slide, please. And it's not just the number of species that are declining, it's also the diversity of species. And that's really important for food chains. And we know that 16% of our species are at risk of extinction. So the legislation really up to now hasn't been working. Pressures on nature have continued to rise, and we need to move towards nature restoration and nature recovery. Next slide, please. So these downward trends were identified in the Gorton report, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, in 2010, that recommended bigger, better, more joined up nature. So in 2018, government set about its 25-year environment plan and the actions needed to improve the environment within a generation. And by 2042, the ambition is to achieve high quality, accessible, natural spaces with increased biodiversity close to where people live. This was followed by the Agriculture Act, which talked about public money for public goods. And then, importantly, the Environment Act, which had species and habitat targets, mandatory biodiversity net gain, and local nature recovery strategies, and I'll pick up on those in a bit more detail in a moment, followed shortly by the 30 by 30 by pledge from government that to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. And then more recently, the Environmental Improvement Plan, building on the 25-year Environment Plan and the Environment Act, and a voluntary tool, the Green Infrastructure Framework, published by Natural England, with a real focus on urban areas and access to nature. Next slide, please. So just focusing in on those Environment Act duties. So it sets out a range of new duties. So all planning permissions granted in England deliver that 10% biodiversity net gain. That will come into effect from February 2024. And there is an enhanced duty for local authorities to conserve enhanced biodiversity and report on their actions, with local planning authorities needing to comply with that duty to have regard to local nature recovery strategies in their local planning policy and decisions. And so linked to that is the responsible authorities appointed by the Secretary of State will lead on local nature recovery strategies, working with a broad range of stakeholders. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to do a bit of a deep dive on 3 of the tools that I've referred to. So 2 from the Environment Act and 1 of the voluntary tools. So the first one is local nature recovery strategies, which will essentially map existing nature, potential nature, and priorities for restoration and creation of nature. And the map on the right-hand side there is the local nature recovery strategy opportunities map generated by Greater Manchester in the pilot. And the priorities there were generated from the needs of nature to developing those sort of functioning ecosystem services, but also the needs of society for the benefits that nature can provide to them, like natural flood management, water quality. Next slide, please. And this example is taken from Bedfordshire's local nature partnership, and it starts to show how different locations we might deploy a range of investment opportunities delivering outcomes for nature. So really layering up things like the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, flood resilience through catchment roughening, biodiversity net gain compensation habitats, environmental land management scheme, carbon sequestration, peat strategies, etc. So starting to see that kind of layering coming into the thinking there. Next slide, please. The second tool I'm going to touch on is biodiversity net gain, and this is in the Environment Act. It is England only. It covers all development under the Town and Country Planning Act and the 2008 Planning Act. It's a minimum 10% gain required, an approval of a net gain plan. Habitat is secured for at least 30 years. And there is this spatial delivery hierarchy with on-site favoured first, followed by off-site compensation, or as a last resort, there will be statutory biodiversity credits. And the baseline and post-intervention unit values are calculated using the standardised biodiversity metric, and there is a national register for net gain sites. So that legislation was passed in November, and it becomes effective from the 12th of February this year. So for Town and Country Planning Act, it then extends to small sites from April and to nationally significant infrastructure projects in late 2025. Next slide, please. The final tool I'm going to talk about is the Green Infrastructure Framework, which is a voluntary tool, but if it's embedded into local plan policies, which is what we're starting to see, then it can really sort of set the requirements around green infrastructure, particularly in urban areas. And it's really to support the greening of our towns and cities. It sets out what good looks like for local planning authorities, developers, parks and green space managers, and provides tools to help plan, design green infrastructure that can deliver multiple benefits. So there are 5 key products in the framework: the principles, which set out the why, the what, and the how of doing good green infrastructure. There are the headline standards, and I'll come on to those in a moment. There is the Green Infrastructure Mapping Database, and there is the Planning and Design Guide, which is really there to support the development of mandatory design codes and the integration of green infrastructure into those. There's also some process journeys which set out for local authorities, for example, how to do a good green infrastructure strategy or how to incorporate GI into local plan policies. There's also a process journey for developers and for neighbourhood planners. Next slide, please. So just quickly, the 5 headline standards, and I won't go through this slide in detail, but the first one is for GI strategy standard. The second is for accessible green space, really picking up on the government's commitment for everyone to have access to good quality green and blue space within 15 minutes walk from home. The third is around an urban nature recovery standard, so really feeding into the importance of urban, feeding into local nature recovery strategies, and increasing the amount of green in our urban areas that is there for nature and nature-rich areas, for example, local nature reserves or wildlife sites. The fourth standard is the urban greening factor, and this is one that has particularly, I think, captured the attention of local authorities, and is really helpful, particularly in an urban context where you may not have much biodiversity baseline. So biodiversity net gain actually may not deliver too much of an uplift in an urban area. So actually, this can be a tool that can help to drive the uplift of greening in urban areas. And there's a fuller sort of look at this in one of the later Homes England sessions this week. And the fifth standard is around urban tree canopy cover, and really looking to see an increase in the uplift of urban tree canopy cover, and for all the benefits that can bring. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So there's just a little bit here on the mapping database, and that can help really to kind of understand where green and blue infrastructure is, how green is your neighbourhood, and particularly the proportion of man-made surface to natural at a 250-metre grid square level. And then who lives within 15 minutes of good quality green space? And finally, where do those gaps really matter in terms of areas of high deprivation or places or people who have limited access to private garden space, for example. And we're currently working on the next version of this database, and that is due for publication in spring of 2024. And that will include an upgrade to Census 21 data. We're currently using Census 11. It'll include climate functionality mapping, so looking at how urban vegetation can help to adapt to climate change, and also urban habitat maps, really understanding where the biodiversity rich areas are to support the urban nature recovery standard and local nature recovery strategies. So next slide, please. How does all this kind of come together, and what does it all add up to? And these tools all fit together to deliver outcomes for climate, for nature, and for health and well-being, and can help to create the nature recovery network. And local authorities will need to use the right tools for the right job. So local nature recovery strategies, for example, will have those high-level ambitions at that higher tier authority level, with a focus on biodiversity and the benefits biodiversity can bring. Green infrastructure strategies can feed into local nature recovery strategies, and they may be more relevant for those supporting authorities, and can include things like access to nature. And they can inform local plans, policies, and design codes. Tools like mandatory biodiversity net gain can be used to fund enhancements of existing green and blue space and their management over a 30-year period. So potentially, you know, I know management and maintenance of particular green infrastructure, but is always a real key issue, and looking at things like urban habitat banks or habitat banks more widely could be a real way to address some of those issues. So this can all provide a common focus for action and investment using public, philanthropic, private sector green finance, and potentially seeing green infrastructure strategies or local nature recovery strategies as the start of a pipeline of projects that could develop into investable projects that seek that green finance investment from private sector, and to garner that with the public sector investment as well. Next slide, please. So just my final slide really is to say we want to see all of this coming together to deliver the biggest nature restoration project in our nation's history, the Nature Recovery Network, and that will benefit people, wildlife, and reach from people's doorsteps to the wider countryside. So I'm going to hand over to Krista now, who's going to talk more about the approaches and how this can be brought to life in local authorities.
Thanks very much, Claire. And next slide, please. So quick introduction to Planning Advisory Service, or PAS for short, just if you're not already familiar with what we do. PAS is part of local government family with a small team of 15, but it's growing, and it's mainly funded by Department for Levelling Up, DLUC, to support English planning authorities. And the wider programme includes supporting on design, develop contributions, local plans, environmental outcome reports and development management. And the Green Wing, or our environmental planning side, has been a recent addition to the team, covering nutrient neutrality, nature recovery, biodiversity net gain, and protected site strategies. And in particular, the project I'm working on, the Nature Recovery Project, which is funded by Natural England, runs up to March 2024 and is supporting local authorities to better understand what the government's emerging nature recovery reforms mean for them and how can they respond through local priorities, activities and partnerships. So next slide, please. So what do the new nature recovery requirements and opportunities mean for local authorities? Well, this slide includes some of the key issues and challenges that we're hearing from local authorities when we're talking to local authorities in terms of our networks and our events. And, you know, as Claire's kind of presented, there's a lot going on. And when you couple this with other reform agendas, whether that's low carbon, planning and health, you know, how do local authorities make sense of it all and bring all of these important agendas together seamlessly? So, you know, key issues, where does nature fit into a council and why? And planning does have a key role, for example, in terms of biodiversity net gain for new development, but often nature projects work across council services, and that's something that we're particularly interested in. So does everyone accept that nature, climate, environment are all connected? And how does this fit in with their priorities, whether or not that's estates, housing, education, highways, etc. And a key issue here is councils are facing significant financial difficulties. So projects more often than not will need to find new ways, new money or ways of reducing costs. But what are the risks of doing nothing? And how do you balance short-term pain versus long-term gain? And there's also a need for long-term monitoring to demonstrate these wider environmental outcomes that can be delivered by nature. And sometimes it's unclear how mitigation or the improvements will be checked, but where the data is coming from and how much we can rely on it. So something that we're hearing a lot also is the challenges around capacity and experience, and we call that cap and cap in PAS. And there are some events that we're delivering at the moment around supporting planning around this. And the skills gap is a particular challenge, not only planning, but also trained ecologists to meet many of these new requirements. So next slide, please. So how do you get councils interested? And, you know, I'll come on to a toolkit that we're developing at the moment, but it's something that we're really actively interested in. You know, how do we kind of engage with other departments that have their own priorities? So from our conversations with councils to date, you know, an important starting point is to understand the priorities of other services. You know, how environmental impacts such as climate change, flooding, air quality, health and well-being affect delivery of those priorities, how nature can act as an enabler, providing effective and cost-efficient solutions. And we know that councils are delivering a range of nature recovery activities, from small-scale quick wins, whether that's something that you're perhaps amending a procurement policy, or it might be, you know, kind of a more larger strategic landscape recovery project. You know, we're keen to understand how they're being delivered across the council and what are the barriers, how are these being addressed and who needs to be engaged. So this might be example when you're looking to implement a sustainable urban drainage project as part of highway improvement works, are there concerns raised about sightlines and drainage? Or when you're installing a new rain garden in a school, are there concerns raised about access and safety, and how are these concerns addressed? So actually we can start, kind of really delivering these things at scale. Often where activities cross over multiple services and priorities, they need champions and teeth, and this needs to be politically framed, the importance of politics and personalities, but they also need revenue, and the lack of this can often be the driver. So although nature and climate crisis are inextricably linked, the decline of nature, still can, somewhat be divorced from climate change, where that's the kind of zero carbon aspects of that. And therefore, there's not enough to tie into wider priorities in terms of environment, care, health, economy and housing. So how you pitch it is really key. So it's about supporting housing development. It's about enabling sustainable transport. It's about better health and well-being. It's about addressing the climate and biodiversity emergencies. It's about reducing flood risk, improving air quality and thriving biodiversity. Next slide, please. So how do you make the case for investment, and how can you make savings, secure funding, investment and generate revenue? There's lots of tools and opportunities coming through from the Environment Act and other related kind of opportunities that are coming forward in terms of this, particularly through biodiversity net gain. And there's an extensive library of research reports on the benefits associated with nature recovery activities, such as green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And I've just pulled out, some key headlines on this slide that can be used as part of the evidence base to demonstrate that case when balancing short-term pain versus long-term gains, such as improved air quality, human health, reduced risk of flooding, that are more difficult to quantify but essential for sustainable, healthy and more resilient places. And I particularly like making the case for investment in green infrastructure in Oxfordshire, which was produced in 2021, which I've taken the kind of key headlines here. And it's important to note that the return on investment that we've got on here is an average of all the different evidence bases that have been kind of reviewed, but will vary depending on the project. But there's also outputs from the Greater Manchester Ignition project, which peer reviewed over 300 studies and includes the nature-based solutions to the climate emergency report, which is a really helpful guide. But also, as a core component of natural capital, biodiversity supports ecosystem services that benefit people in the economy. So when thinking about actions, you can also take and consider, the value of nature in terms of a natural capital approach. So a number of local authorities have also been using natural capital accounts to measure the benefits provided by their natural assets to its businesses, public services and residents. And not only do these measure the benefits, but they provide a way in which decision makers at all levels have the tools and the evidence to make more informed, joined up decisions. And Claire mentioned at the start, just picked out some of the natural capital, the national kind of figures that are out there. And some of the work I was previously involved in Greater Manchester, we carried out a natural capital account and valuation, which came up, actually that the total value provided by natural environment in Greater Manchester is at least £1 billion each year. So in terms of air quality regulation, vegetation improves air quality, prevents 370 hospital admissions each year and helps avoid 1,200 life years lost. So the key thing here really is in terms of, understanding the value from our natural environment is if we don't continue to look after and maintain our natural environment, then we risk losing these benefits that then has a consequent knock-on cost to society. Next slide. So from a strategic point of view, how can local authorities support delivery of the climate emergency and the loss of nature? Well, there's some excellent examples out there from a whole raft of resources, including Natural England's process journey for local planning authorities, but also a bit further afield in terms of Nature Scotland's guidance on nature-based solutions for local authorities. And the types of examples in terms of these, kind of strategic delivery is, developing climate change strategies that include not only just in terms of resilience and nature, but, investing in green infrastructure and taking action for pollinators. In terms of young people learning and play, improving green space quality close to schools, provide places for outdoor learning and play, and co-design projects with young people, stronger communities and sustainable places, making more use of the whole public estate for people and nature, growing the network of quality green spaces for people and supporting the use of green spaces by all. Health and well-being, improving well-being through providing access to nature for all, improving and greening the active travel network and embedding green infrastructure, and also inclusive economic growth, attracting inward investment through high quality places, investing in key natural visitor attractions and grow nature-based industries. Next slide, please. Often the greatest impact, and I'm sure you agree, is actually seeing these types of activities. They're actually being delivered, being involved in their delivery on the ground. And I've pulled out some of the nature-based solutions that we're commonly seeing and are referred to in the Natural England's Green Infrastructure Design Guide, and actually kind of linking these up with services so you can actually understand the linkage there. But obviously the Green Infrastructure Design Guide provides a lot more practical examples of how the grey can be turned into the green. But listed here, you've got for highways, you've got tree planting and swales, sustainable transport, green corridors, education, eco schools and rain gardens, estates, particularly buildings, green and blue roofs, green walls, estates, they're green spaces, reduced mowing and pollinator planting, leaky dams and slowing the flow, health and social care, you've got green social prescribing and community growing, and leisure and recreation, you've got green gyms, parks and accessible green spaces. And the biodiversity reporting duty guidance, and Claire referred to the biodiversity reporting duty, the guidance published by government provides a really useful overview of the types of activities that local authorities and public bodies can take, including managing land to improve biodiversity, whether that's managing their land to improve biodiversity, making space for wildlife, enhancing protected sites, particularly in kind of national parks, specific actions or areas of outstanding natural beauty, improving how you manage buildings, but also importantly education, advising and raising awareness, reviewing internal policies and processes, and preparing for biodiversity net gain. Next slide, please. So what's going on elsewhere? From our work at PAS, we've seen a number of Frontrunner authorities delivering a range of innovative approaches to support their nature recovery ambitions. So back in 2022, we held conversations with 20 early adopter local authorities, and the emerging insights from these conversations have been captured as part of a report together with 12 case studies which are available on our website. I haven't got time to run through all of these, so I'm just going to pick out some key highlights and key messages. So the first one on this slide is from Bath and North East Somerset Council, which covers the importance of meeting wider corporate priorities. Nature recovery is not one person's responsibility, and this needs internal and external collaboration. There have been a number of key developments that have taken place in Bath and North East Somerset to support this, including declaring a climate and ecological emergency, establishing the role of a biodiversity champion for an elected member, and emphasising the environment within the corporate strategy. Ultimately, this has all led to the setting up of an environment team 18 months ago, creating several new posts to support engagement, collaboration and delivery on green infrastructure, biodiversity net gain and the local nature recovery strategy. And more recently, the Council's new economic strategy will be adopted on February the 1st, which sets out a new approach to local economic development and prioritises meeting the needs of residents and places whilst reducing impacts on the natural resources and the environment. Next slide. So I've seen in the chat and a lot of questions are kind of coming up around biodiversity net gain, and we have a separate programme that's being led by my colleague Becky Mobley on supporting councils around biodiversity net gain, and we have a website of resources there that kind of answers a lot of the frequently asked questions that are coming up and provides advice and support to local authorities in terms of getting prepared for mandatory net gain. But Buckinghamshire's council case study illustrates how cross-departmental working with ecology teams, legal departments and planning teams is really, really important when preparing for mandatory biodiversity net gain. It's not just solely the responsibility of planning, it covers a whole multitude of different department responsibilities. And Buckinghamshire became a unitary in 2020, which led to a restructuring of the ecology teams into one central unit. So a year later, they funded the equivalent of 1.6 full-time equivalent biodiversity net gain officers to aid their preparations for the introduction of biodiversity net gain. So, this is some time away, as you can see on the timeline from when we've got biodiversity net gain becoming mandatory in February. But having inserted the biodiversity net gain policies in the emerging local plans prior to becoming a unitary, Buckinghamshire Council then produced a supplementary planning document to support the delivery of biodiversity net gain. And this document's been shared widely amongst our PAS networks of local authorities, and found it really useful in terms of that exchange and that sharing of that learning. And since its publication, further supporting documents and templates have been produced, which will be of particular interest. So you've got a biodiversity net gain decision-making flowchart and procedure note for development management planners, a biodiversity net gain section 106 template for use with developers, interim strategic significant guidance for use with the biodiversity metric, habitat bank criteria, section 106 agreement for use with habitat bank providers, and lots more, including a biodiversity net gain unit financial calculator to sense check and evaluate information being submitted by developers and habitat bank providers. So a lot going on there in anticipation of biodiversity net gain coming in. And as I said, our PAS website has a whole raft of resources for local authorities on B&G, and if you're not already part of the B&G network for local authority officers only, then you can sign up to that and email pas@local.gov.uk. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to come on to use of innovative funding models, and with my I'm seconded to Planning Advisory Service, so my substantive post is with Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and for the past couple of years we've been looking on at using natural capital investment approaches and developing a more longer-term sustainable business model. So the Greater Manchester Environment Fund was formed in 2021 by a partnership between the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Lancashire Wildlife Trust. The Greater Manchester Environment Fund provides a mechanism to collect and distribute funds for environmental projects across Greater Manchester. So to date, it's brought in over £6 million worth of funding to deliver projects on the ground. So one of the first successful funding bids was from DEFRA's Green Recovery Challenge Fund, securing 1.8 million to support a diverse range of projects from a range of providers, including Northern Roots, which is the UK's largest urban farm and eco park on 160 acres of green space, just 10 minutes from the town centre. But also 2.6 million has been secured for delivery of the Mayor's Green Spaces Fund, providing small grants to community groups, bringing forward much needed green space projects in areas where they're needed the most. And the Greater Manchester Environment Fund has also secured funding, so seed funding from DEFRA's Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund to develop the business models required for habitat banking and carbon trading. So these models are looking to stimulate investment in peatland habitats and setting up of a biodiversity net gain investment facility. And currently, much needed support is being provided to the local authorities to bring forward their own biodiversity net gain offset sites. Next slide, please. So another really key message here and is around the value of coordination and partnerships. And since the publication of Essex County Council's Green Infrastructure Strategy and subsequent reports from the Climate Action Commission, a local nature partnership was established in March 2022 to bring together a range of Essex's local organisations, businesses and charities to work together to deliver the Climate Action Commission's recommendations. And in particular, the local nature partnership oversees the delivery of four targets by 2030 drawn from the Essex Climate Action Commission's Net Zero report. To support the functioning of the local nature partnership, Essex County Council employs a local nature recovery coordinator who provides essential support to bring in various stakeholders and projects together to explore opportunities for delivery. So that the board meets 4 times a year, with several subgroups meeting more regularly, including task and finish groups, including agriculture, biodiversity net gain and local nature recovery strategies. And a really simple and effective way of engaging with a range of key stakeholders is through the publication of a quarterly local nature partnership newsletter, which has proved really successful for ensuring that members of the working groups remain small enough for decisions to be made, while external groups and individuals interested in local nature partnership and its developments can be updated. Next slide. So I'm just going to finish off here, last couple of minutes of my presentation, just on the Nature Recovery Toolkit, the draft Nature Recovery Toolkit that PAS is developing at the moment. And going back to one of my early slides, there's a lot going on at the moment, and sometimes it can be difficult for local authorities to make sense of all of this agenda, reform agendas coming forward, and take advantage of the opportunities that are coming through the government's nature recovery reform. So as part of our Natural England funded project, PAS are developing a nature recovery self-serve toolkit to help local authorities take advantage of the opportunities for turning their statutory must-do requirements that we've kind of we've covered before through Claire's summary in terms of coming through the Environment Act, for the whole council to support delivery of their strategic and corporate priorities on health, air quality, climate change, adaptation, etc. So the key thing about the toolkit is it focuses on council priorities, the land they hold, the services they deliver, and explores how nature can act as an enabler for these and the quick wins that can be made and delivered. So why should local authorities use the toolkit? So there's a number of advantages. There's across the council political buy-in and joining up across work across departments, read across into other plans and strategies and streamlining benefits, a clear understanding of how to deliver change, save costs and securing additional funding, better local nature recovery strategy production readiness. So there's already things going on within the council in terms of how different activities, different services can start changing their business as usual to start embedding and enabling nature to help deliver some of their priorities and projects, and a short list of priority activities and interventions that can start to be delivered. Next slide. So what's in the toolkit? The toolkit includes a number of key components. A workshop planning tool, so it sets out a suggested pattern of how a series of engagement workshops can be organised and delivered. You've got training modules, so slide decks or recordings to introduce people who might not be familiar with this area and to lead them to think about why it matters for them and what they can do about it. And a series of technical appendices, including a useful action template setting out council activities, assets, responsibilities, as well as useful data layers which can inform conversations. How should local authorities use the toolkit? Well, as I said before, and I emphasised right at the start of the slide before, is the toolkit has been designed to be a self-serve process, so which can be easily adapted by local authorities to engage with the right people from across the council, work with the right people across the council to decide what to do, and understand the oversight and governance requirements for chosen priorities. So local authorities can choose how they want to deliver the toolkit, which can be adapted and localised to meet their needs. And lastly, we've been developing the toolkit since September. So back in November, we held a series of workshop sessions with local authorities to understand their needs and to test and challenge the toolkit and the ideas behind it and where it can be improved. So we're now at a stage where we're starting to test the toolkit with a couple of interested local authorities who are on the front foot of a lot of this agenda to provide external and expert perspectives. We're also holding 3 roadshow events for local authorities, officers in March that are looking to embed nature recovery across their own local authorities to find more about the draft toolkit, the resources that have been developed so far and how to use them. And it's important to note that the toolkit's constantly evolving, so we're keen to hear about local authorities' own nature recovery ambitions and progress to date to inform development and improvement of the toolkit. And subject to funding, we're looking to roll out the toolkit with a number of local authorities April onwards. So it's a really exciting time for us to get involved and get the toolkit out and used by local authorities to better understand how they can respond to the government's nature recovery requirements. Thank you. Handing over to Duncan.
Thanks for that, Krista. I'm well, whether this is a graveyard shift or not, but I do have the pretty pictures because I've got some of the case studies. So actually trying to demonstrate how a lot of the sort of topics that have been covered by Claire and Krista have actually sort of come to fruition in the city of Manchester. Now, it is worth saying from the outset that obviously we have the Environment Act in terms of its recent adoption in the past couple of years, and obviously all the work that's been going into that in terms of local nature recovery strategies and things like biodiversity net gain, which is clearly coming very much into sharp focus with its commencement on the 12th of Feb. But what I'm going to first cover before I get to the pretty pictures of actual on the ground case studies is some of the context, because Manchester's been doing this stuff for much like many local authorities for many years before we even had the concept of local nature recovery strategies. So I want to briefly outline some of the kind of strategic policy stuff that has helped informed our journey to where we've got to and then how that sort of comes to fruition in the couple of case studies I'm going to go through. You will note there is a little bit about biodiversity net gain and urban greening factor at the end of the presentation. That is by no means any great detail, because I know there is another session specifically all around this. It's really just to touch on some of the work that we've been doing in preparation, and largely, again, more than happy to sort of share experience with colleagues around other local authorities out with or outside of this presentation. So can we move to the next slide, please? So as I say, like all councils, we like to produce lots of strategies, and we've got a story here in 9 parts, as I've termed it. So in essence, what we've got is our corporate strategy sitting at the top, which is the R Manchester strategy, produced around about 6-7 years ago. In fact, it's going through a major refresh this year. Very much sets out the kind of corporate view of the world, both in social, economic and environmental terms. Sitting directly below that, of course, climate change in terms of a specific climate change action plan. The local plan, which is very much in terms of planning policy, that's very much my realm. I'm the team leader for the planning strategy team. So part of my world, or a significant chunk of my world, is the local plan. Another significant chunk of my world is green infrastructure. So I also lead the team that deal with green infrastructure in the city, and sitting alongside and betwixt local plan and climate change, all things green and blue. And I emphasize it is green and blue, because we do have 3 rivers come into the city, 3 main rivers, plus a number of canals that cross the city. So we are very much alive to the fact that even though a fair bit of that water infrastructure may well be buried beneath the city centre streets, it is certainly still there. And I'll come on to some of that in particular with respect to Mayfield, about how we're revealing the river once again, or one of the rivers anyway. It's fair to say that that green and blue work has been around for quite a number of years. That actual original green and blue infrastructure strategy was adopted back in 2015. We did do a refresh of it a couple of years back in 2022, and there are various action plans that sit behind that in terms of the activity and the work that we do, either within the City Council and its services, or more importantly, in many ways, is the collaborative work we do with all sorts of organisations, be they local communities, regional organisations, national organisations, in terms of work around the city. Sitting beneath all of that, as I say, we do have an implementation plan around green and blue, and also, again, a very specific work around trees, both in terms of tree planting and understanding what we've got in terms of tree canopy cover and aspects around that, with a new tree and woodland action plan that we have just refreshed through consultation in very recent weeks. Other aspects, there's a park strategy, which is colleagues within our park services looking at the longer term future of how we manage our parks and services around that. There's a biodiversity strategy, which again comes back to my team, and another strategy called Our Rivers, Our Cities, which picks up around the fact that we have the 3 main rivers, the Medlock, the Irk and the Mersey coming through the city, and I'm going to cover that in a slide very shortly. So next slide, please. So some of the context, I'm not going to go through everything, but in terms of the green and blue infrastructure strategies, I'd say produced initially back in 2015, updated a couple of years back. What it has tried to do is obviously capture what we've got in terms of quality and function with respect to both green and blue infrastructure within the city, but also to look at how that interacts with the growth and the development in terms of housing, employment, etc., that is coming forward within the city. Clearly not everywhere in the city is growing at the same rate. There are key development areas within the city centre, areas in close proximity to the city centre, particular development down in the south of the city around the airport and Wythenshawe, that have a particular sort of focus in terms of how we interact between the actual hard sort of development and then the green and blue infrastructure, but seeing how we can interweave that in terms of looking at that neighbourhood planning and delivering that both in terms of the economic factors of growth, but also the social and environmental factors behind that growth. It is also looking at connectivity and accessibility to that green and blue infrastructure. Yes, we do, for a city that is very highly urbanized, we do have some significant resources, but because of the urbanization and particularly the sort of earlier parts of industrial revolution, etc., some of that resource is by no means very accessible, partly because of just the nature of how the city has developed over the many years. So there are challenges in terms of, you know, we understand what's out there, but how do we actually utilize that in a sort of careful manner, not only in terms of the benefit for the people, the residents of the city, but also obviously looking at how we maintain, enhance the biodiversity value of that green and blue infrastructure. And then we do, particularly through colleagues working in my team, a lot of work in terms of awareness raising, understanding of the benefits of green and blue. So there's a lot of stuff done in terms of open days, tagging into other events, working with organisations like the Lancashire Wildlife Trust in terms of just having a better understanding of what is actually literally on people's doorsteps in terms of wildlife and other biodiversity within the city. Next slide, please. I was just going to say, we're going to touch on Our Rivers, Our City. This was a strategy we developed over about a course of 12 months back in 2021, realizing that we've got particular opportunities and challenges in terms of some of our new development. One of our key development areas is an area called Victoria North, which is an area that stretches from just adjacent to the city centre through East Manchester through to an area called Collyhurst. We've got a plan, and it will sit within the local plan, of around about 15,000 new dwellings to be delivered in that area over the next sort of 10 to 15 years. It's an area characterised by a lot of former industrial land, particularly as you get nearer to the city centre, and as you move out to Collyhurst, sort of fairly, well, more traditional sort of low-rise council estates and the like. So various challenges in terms of how we bring that forward for development, and it also has one of our major rivers going through there. So this was one of the major pushes in terms of looking at how we developed this particular strategy. Just the few points I've got down there is the outcome from that strategy has already sort of started to bear fruit in terms of some of the work that's emerged from the collaborative working on that Our Rivers, Our City strategy. So Groundwork, who were one of the key organisations involved in that, have used it to bring forward £1.2 million bid in terms of their work on what they call the Resilient River Valleys project, which enables people with to upskill in terms of their environmental skills, to bring them back into the workforce and work on various projects around the various river valleys. There's the Love the River Irk project, which again, between Groundwork and Mersey Rivers, has been delivered partly through the Our Rivers, Our City strategy, but also through some other work that they were doing. Natural England, name checked again in terms of some of the work they're doing, and also the Environment Agency looking at some of the improvements to the Irk, particularly in relation to the fact that that's where we're doing this major effort of development proposals around Victoria North. Next slide, please. So now to some pretty pictures and some actual specific projects. So Mayfield Park is a 6.5 acre park that has been developed, created very close into the city centre. It's right by Piccadilly Station, which is the main line station into Manchester. So for those of you who venture up to Manchester, if you look across from platforms 12 and 13, you would be able to see the main Mayfield buildings, which are the old warehousing buildings, and beyond that is the Mayfield Park. It was opened back in 2022. It is part of a wider project, so it's not just about a park. It is about significant new office development, employment development, and residential development that will feature around it. But interestingly, and perhaps in contrast sometimes to the way projects unfold, the infrastructure in terms of the green infrastructure in the park has been delivered first, rather than delivering the commercial and residential development. It is the first of a city centre park. So various people say it's either 90 years or 100 years since we last saw any kind of proposal of this in Manchester. safe to say it's been a very long time since we've had a green space like this within, or a new green space like this within the city centre. It does incorporate some of the sponge city thinking. So where we've been talking about local nature recovery and some of the elements in terms of what it might deliver within terms of this concept of sponge city, Manchester is worked on a project called Grow Green, and I'll come to that with the other case study as well. But working with, in partnership with some cities across the rest of Europe, but also working with our sister city over in China, Wuhan, who have done a lot of work around the sponge city concept. What do we mean by sponge city? It's fairly self-explanatory in the sense that it's looking at how we can better improve the environment to absorb water within that environment, rather than having to deal with it through sort of hard landscape management in terms of traditional drainage. So it's looking at sustainable urban drainage in the round and how we deliver that. And I'll come on to the West Gorton Sponge Park shortly about how that's come forward. But this is incorporated within Mayfield in terms of how we've got the Medlock as a river coming through there, but also in terms of how we utilise the green infrastructure that sits around that river to incorporate that sponge city thinking. One of the things that did come forward from doing the work around there is actually revealing elements of that river that hadn't seen the light of day for close on 100 years. So it has opened up some of that river in terms of its accessibility and actually being physically in sight in terms of within that park. So that it's been a major sort of engineering task in that sense, but also looking to incorporate all the sort of environmental and biodiversity elements into it. Next slide, please. It is worth pointing out in terms of the challenges, yes, it's the first element that's been delivered in a much wider master plan. That master plan's been in the making since the early 2000s through various regeneration frameworks that were adopted by the City Council over sort of the past sort of 10, 15 years. It also links, as I say, to the wider area. So in terms of the picture that you see before you, the railway station, Piccadilly station, is in the northern part of that picture. Clearly, Piccadilly itself, in terms of the railway station, still has some quite significant potential development to take place. If we were talking about this 6 months ago, I would have been talking about a little project called HS2 and how that was going to come into Piccadilly. As we all know now at the moment, HS2 is not progressing in that way envisaged, but nonetheless there are still significant regional rail projects that like as not will come forward over the next sort of 10 to 15 years through there, because of just the simple requirement in terms of improving that transport infrastructure into the city. It has driven a very strong placemaking agenda in terms of delivering that public realm, and as I say, quite unusually delivering that public realm first and foremost before we bring forward the commercial development. And also, as in terms of what it's looked at the historical aspects. So Mayfield was well, it's had a number of lives going back 150 years, 200 years. It was a dye works. It was known across the world in terms of the printing patterns that were produced there, in terms of the various wallpapers and the like, which turned the river various interesting colours in terms of when the dye works was operating. Latterly, it became a railway goods yard, and there are still substantial buildings sitting there in terms of that railway architecture, which are already have been repurposed in terms for leisure uses and for that side of things in terms as called meanwhile uses, whilst various other aspects come forward in terms of the commercial development, but they will be interweaved into that process. Next slide, please. Then, as I say, with the opportunities, it is then, as it's delivered not only the 6.5 acres in terms of the actual parkland, substantial amount of mature trees that, or standard trees that were brought in, a lot of planting, etc., that was put in there in terms of bringing that forward. It is interweaved within the existing historic buildings. Interestingly, one of the aspects was some of the steel from one of the former concrete culverts that sat above or formed what was the River Medlock going under the city, has now been repurposed to contribute to one of the pedestrian bridges that's actually being built within the park. And during the process, Victorian wells were discovered. In fact, there was an entire bathhouse that was known about, I think, but not necessarily the extent of it. So there are various sort of heritage aspects that have been brought to life again, including the use of the wells for watering off the site in terms of some of the irrigation for the new park. Next slide, please. So design concept, just another quick pretty picture in terms of what it ultimately may look like. And then next slide, some images of what it actually looks like. So this is very much focusing on the park as it stands at the moment. And it is quite incredible in the sense of how it has come together as a project, and particularly in terms of delivery of that green infrastructure first and foremost, and is very much now a component part of the city in terms of not only for the Mayfield site itself, but how it links then through to the main part of the city centre. Next slide, please. So we'll move on to West Gorton. Well, West Gorton, as I say, it was a European Commission funded project with a number of other cities looking at nature-based solutions. First, so developed over a number of years through that program and project and funding. The actual park was opened back in July 2020, and we'll come on to some photos of it shortly. And as I say, it follows these sponge principles, where incorporating sustainable urban design or urban drainage rather, to allow the rainwater to flow through various systems in terms of control of that water flow, but also in terms of improving the potential water quality that sits within that system. The development of that park was very much, again, part of a wider master planning program, and I'll come on to some of the details around that, working with the community in West Gorton. So it wasn't just about the delivery of a sponge park, it was also about delivery of new social housing, affordable housing within that area, and I'll come on to some of the details around that on the next couple of slides. But also what it also allowed us to do was to work very closely with our colleagues at the University of Manchester, so that not only delivering the sponge park, but then ensuring that we had a well-crafted and understood monitoring regime to understand how the park performs and develops over the years as it sort of beds in effect. Next slide. So some of the challenges, well, one of the significant challenges was that it sat within a wider regeneration framework, going again back sort of 10, 15 years. A very complex project in terms of delivering the housing elements within that area, but also looking at what had been an existing very underutilized green space and how we could bring that forward in terms of this approach to Sponge Park. Someone I noticed did actually ask a question about BNG and service charges with respect to passing that on to householders. Well, this is all very much in the world before BNG, but part of the conversation was about how would you fund and continue to ensure that the Sponge Park delivered in a way that had been envisaged. And there was a plan and conversation around potentially looking at service charges and some kind of management fee that would be attached to the new housing that came forward. Ultimately, the political decision was taken not to follow that down that route. So that has then led to having to bring forward alternative ways of how we fund that, well, not the delivery of the park, but the ongoing maintenance of that park. So that has been one of the more interesting, knotty problems to deal with. It does bring forward in terms of looking at how the technical elements in terms of design and how they were brought forward. Inevitably there were some challenges behind that, and then ensuring that the landscape design did ensure that the flow of water was managed in a way that took the surface water that was going to be taken through that Sponge Park process, did actually work in a way that was envisaged. Through the Grow Green project, and again, if anyone's particularly interested in the detail, there are links I can send through after the publication, or after the presentation rather, in terms of the project. There's a showcase website which sets out a lot of the detail around the project, but it did help us understand about some of the key elements of how we would deliver these kind of projects. This is very much quite a large scale project. What it's helping us to try and do is understand the learning, how we might then put that into smaller scale projects within highway schemes, other development sites, but on smaller scale. So actually trying to understand where we might be able to successfully bring forward elements of this project rather than necessarily replicating a West Gorton sponge park in other parts of the city. What component parts might we bring forward to other parts or other projects? Next slide, please. So the opportunities were built around the various themes that you can see there, and it also looked at the wider application. Then we took it through the Our Rivers, Our City work, and it is informing our work around biodiversity net gain and our consideration around policy approaches for urban green factor. Next slide, we'll move on to the pretty pictures now. So design concept again. So the site on the left is what West Gorton used to look like. So as you can see, quite an interesting sort of setup in terms of residential development, not necessarily a terribly satisfactory or well cared for sort of a local open space environment. Design concept that was brought through on the right, and then next slide, please. And these are some of the pictures of what the sponge park looks like in reality. Again, if anyone wants to see more detail around this, as I say, there are the pages I can direct you to, which give more sort of photos and a heads up view of the actual reality of the delivery of the project. Next slide. I was going to very briefly touch on biodiversity net gain. This is really just a flag. We've been doing, quite apart from all the work through green infrastructure, Our Rivers, Our City, biodiversity strategy, trees and woodlands, delivering projects such as Mayfield, or working with colleagues to deliver projects such as Mayfield and West Gorton. Clearly, we have been trying to prepare for the forthcoming mandatory biodiversity net gain. The key project that's sat within my team is working with consultants that are listed there, the Environment Partnership, Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and Groundwork, to look at how we would consider biodiversity net gain delivery within the City of Manchester, and particularly with a focus on how we would deliver on our own City Council land, where sites were not capable of necessarily delivering the full biodiversity net gain on site, and therefore where could we look to deliver off site. So we've done a lot of extensive work around that over the past sort of nine months or so. And the reporting on that is pretty much now at a final stage. We've done some presentations to some other organisations. We've done some presentations to our own members, and the work itself will partly inform what we then develop in our own emerging local plan in terms of policy, but also help to inform some of those practical challenges in terms of delivering off-site biodiversity net gain within the city. I'm not going to go into the detail because I know we've got another session at another time with other colleagues dealing with that. But again, I'm more than happy to sort of catch up with folk post presentation, post this session this afternoon, if anyone wants any further detail around that project. The only thing I would like to pick up, which is on the next slide, is just a bunch of pretty pictures, which is around urban green factor. It was mentioned certainly in Claire's presentation. I think Krista did touch on it briefly as well. This is an area that is greatly interests us from a policy, sort of planning policy side of things, but also in terms, again, of the practical implementation. And this is kind of brings us back to looking at how we've done things in Mayfield, how we've done things in West Gorton, and how we might deliver those in other projects, be they larger scale or smaller scale. And the urban green factor as a policy lever and a policy approach to engage with our developer community over how that might be a practical approach. We by no means see biodiversity net gain necessarily as the silver bullet for biodiversity within the City of Manchester. Yes, it's certainly going to help, and yes, it will deliver an element of biodiversity, but urban green factor as a complementary policy approach sitting alongside BNG is very much where we're exploring that in terms of how that might assist us both on those sites where BNG is, well, sites inevitably will be expected to deliver BNG, but how that then might interweave with the urban green factor side of things, not only in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of water management, in terms of climate change, resilience, adaptation, in terms of some of the benefits that it will bring in terms of social and health benefits with respect to the greening of the local environment. that's pretty much my session. I think it goes on to last slide, which is probably a thank you slide, all being well. Oh no, it's a Q&A slide. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to our presenters, Claire, Krista and Duncan, for some great presentations there. So no, thank you for the all the attendees as well. We've got a question and answer little session now over the next 10 to 15 minutes. So we've got a few questions here to ask the presenters. If you turn your camera back on, that'd be fantastic. And I'll ask the first question, which is for Claire. How often will the data included in the GI maps be updated? Will it rely solely on census information regarding availability of green space?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So the GI mapping draws on about 40 different data sets. And in terms of green space sort of mapping, one of the primary sort of data sets is from the Ordnance Survey green space mapping data, and that is updated regularly. So we will draw down that data probably once a year. So there'll be an annual upgrade, and we are looking to also then extend the functionality to incorporate some of those sort of areas that I talked about in the presentation. But yeah, no, it is updated more regularly than the census data.
Thank you, Claire. Another question for yourself, Claire. How does this work on minerals and waste sites as we ask for a restoration plan upfront, which BNG and have a 5-year aftercare plan are included? By what I've seen, nobody seems to know about how this will fit in. Any advice would be appreciated.
Yeah, quick answer on this. So there is reference to this in the biodiversity net gain planning practice guidance, but expect more guidance to come, and do put pressure on or pick up with DLUC, Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities, because they lead on this area. So yeah, that's it from me, Tom.
Thank you very much, Claire. A question for Duncan. Often street trees / swales are not accepted by highways authorities. Can they be encouraged by DEFRA / government to do so?
I'm not going to comment for DEFRA or the government. It was just I was going to bring in our own practical experience on this. Maybe I'm not saying we've got it cracked, but certainly our dialogue with our colleagues in highways has significantly improved over the past sort of 2-3 years, largely down to, I would say, potentially highways themselves. They now have a dedicated officer sat within their team who's looking very much at sustainable urban drainage, how that might be achieved. We understand the challenges in terms of the adoption and the maintenance of that. So we very much do understand it's not just a simple matter of, put it in and everything's going to be fine and dandy. But I think what has been a significant benefit for us is highways' own preparedness to sort of engage in these conversations, bring in additional resource. The officer they brought in actually was one of their local flood risk officers previously, so had a very good understanding of flood risk anyway, but was looking at, what are the benefits in terms of highway design with respect to that, and how might we achieve that. This isn't just necessarily always and Krista sort of touched on this as well, because we don't just necessarily always deal with this from the lens of Manchester solely. So Greater Manchester itself, the Transport for Greater Manchester have produced a guide around street design and various aspects around that. So there are various elements that are sort of helping for us to try and focus on this. I wouldn't say we've necessarily got it cracked, because inevitably when schemes are then finally delivered, they're not always quite what they look like on the scheme drawings, shall we say, and the delivery of those schemes obviously has to be closely monitored in terms of their actual efficiency and the cost side of it. And we are very acutely aware that our colleagues in highways don't have massive maintenance budgets, etc., to continue along some of these lines. But at least it is just trying to address how we might look at this in appropriate places. So not necessarily a magic answer that we've got it all sorted, but those conversations do take place, and we do look to try and sort of bring that forward.
Thank you, Duncan. Question for Krista. Could you recommend?
Tom, sorry, could I just? I'm just going to add to those helpful comments from Duncan. Just in terms of new development, the Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act will have that requirement for sustainable drainage systems in new development. That's something that's going to come in and change the landscape a little bit. The National Planning Policy Framework already has that requirement for all streets to be tree lined, so there's something in there as well on sort of new development. But I'd really support sort of Duncan's comments around sort of engaging with the Highways Department, and I know there's been some really positive conversations going on with water companies as well in terms of looking at retrofitting sustainable drainage systems, street trees, rain gardens into existing areas. So Mansfield is really an interesting example. So I think there is quite a lot of thinking being done around this at the moment, and GLA were also looking at a sort of dig once approach, so that they could, whilst they're doing their sort of works, their streets, they can, in terms of utilities, they're looking at incorporating rain gardens, and there might be opportunities around that with electric vehicles sort of charging points coming in as well.
Thank you, Claire. The next question for Krista. Could you recommend a good resource for modelling BNG based on the current metric for on-site solutions for developers? Obviously, this doesn't substitute for ecological expertise, but it would be good to do a decent job of self-assessed sites, stroke prospective sites, in order to think of how new development sites within a habitat-rich plot and links with habitats outside the red line wherever this is possible.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'd actually, I mean, obviously in the first instance, the biodiversity metric is the key tool that's been produced for developers in terms of looking at biodiversity net gain in its purest sense. But there's a number of other complementary tools, and Claire, you might want to chip into this as well. But there's other tools that have been produced, and including the environmental benefits from nature tool, which kind of provides or looks into, you know, kind of additional to work alongside the biodiversity metric, but you know, kind of mirrors that approach, but actually applies a matrix of scores for different habitats, ecosystem services. So it kind of actually does a little bit more than that, and actually kind of looks at, you know, how can you deliver wider benefits in terms of that. So there's the environmental benefits of nature tool, but also the nature tool, which is the nature assessment tool for urban rural environments, which again has been developed. You know, some of these are still in kind of their kind of you know, kind of testing format, but if you go on the Ecosystem Knowledge Network, I'll actually just kind of put the link in here to that, and you can have a look at those. But the Ecosystem Knowledge Network is a really good resource in terms of lots of these other tools and resources. And just going back to that highways discussion again, you know, in terms of key messages around that is, you know, don't reinvent the wheel. There's lots of other really excellent work that's been done by others. You know, as Duncan mentioned, you know, a lot of the work that's going on in Manchester and Greater Manchester around SUDS. There was a €3 million Euro scheme, funded scheme that's finished now, called Ignition. But again, Ignition was looking at, you know, the kind of business case around SUDS and nature-based solutions, and there was a lot of work that was done to engage with highway engineers. And as Duncan mentioned, there's you know, a SUDS design guide for highways that TFGM and Greater Manchester Combined Authority and others are developing. I think that'll be, you know, kind of published shortly, I think, Duncan. But also I would look on the Syria and Sustrain websites, and there's a really excellent, I chaired a Syria event a couple of months ago, and there's Greener Grange Town, which is a brilliant case study in Wales in terms of how they've actually, you know, kind of implemented SUDS in an existing, so this is retrofit SUDS in an existing residential area. Obviously lots of key issues that were being raised in terms of barriers to that around, you know, sight lines, around drainage channels, etc. So, you know, have a look at that case study, because there's learning already out there. So, you know, don't reinvent the wheel. There's lots of learning out there. Let's learn from those that are already doing this and build on that.
Thank you, Krista. Next question is a joint question for Krista and Claire. BNG has long-term benefits, but in the short term will affect the viability and deliverability of developments. Has there been any work to address this?
So I can chip in first on that if you like. There's been quite a bit of research done by DEFRA and also places like GLA, some individual authorities around sort of biodiversity net gain, and also on the urban greening factor to understand the impact on viability. And in most situations, that seems to suggest that there won't be an impact on viability, and certainly with the legal requirement of 10%, that can't be challenged on viability grounds. Above that, on a sort of 20, if your local authority is looking at going above the 10% level in local plans, for example, then that 20% or whatever that figure is could be challenged. So you'd need to think about the evidence to support that. But in general, green infrastructure costs and related costs are generally sort of lower than for other infrastructure. So yeah, just a few reflections from me. Anything to add to that, Krista?
Tom, I've just, I mean, obviously, yeah, this is a key thing that comes up, and on the PAS FAQs, there's a bit more information on that kind of viability studies, and obviously the analysis there in terms of residential costs to developers, kind of being quite, there's a range of expected costs, but relative to build costs, but they're relatively small for brownfield lands. But I think what it does acknowledge that particular regions, Midlands, North, etc., that have high potential costs, as a percentage of build costs, whether that's land remediation, etc., then obviously, where there are lower developable land prices, that indicates a potential for site-specific housing viability issues. So, it's not kind of a complete picture, and it does vary across the country. But if you check out the PAS response on that in terms of just that, kind of coverage in terms of what the expectation is around viability.
Okay, thank you, Krista. And at that point, I think we'll wrap up with the question and answer. So thank you very much to all three presenters for doing that. It's great. Thank you for your time and all the contributions. And I think I'd like to just sort of wrap up now in the last minute or two, just to finish up, and thank everyone for attending.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.